Our next major speaker is a very capable young man who's going to be able to do it handsomely. But to introduce him, I'd like to bring out Mr. Trent Rosenlieb of Linn Energy, one of the platinum sponsors for this year's summit.
Thank you.
Now, you know the drill. You got to pass the test. All right. Created in 1916, this club is credited with building the first such club in the nation.
I'm going to guess, what is the Taft Petroleum Club?
He's right. They've all been right today, haven't they? You got some very bright people here, I told you. They should try out for the show. Now, I'll let you introduce our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for introducing me as young. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Linn Energy, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Alex Epstein, founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress and author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. A philosopher by training, Alex routinely engages debate with environmental activists regarding energy, industry, and the environment, as they relate to the bigger picture of the benefits of fossil fuel and nuclear energy. With that, ladies and gentlemen, Alex Epstein.
Not mic'd at all. They told me to yell, but it would probably run out of voice a little too quickly. All right, so you can probably see my inconspicuous shirt even from the back. So it says, I love fossil fuels, and to preempt the question, if you go to ilovefossilfuels.com, you can get one and wear it with pride. So often when I speak to audiences like this that are generally oil friendly, people assume, oh, you're gonna come preach to the choir. I hear that a lot. And I have two problems with this supposition. So the first problem is that the oil industry does not have a choir, right? Nobody who's speaking, right? There's not a lot of us speaking now. A lot of us believe in it strongly. I'm from outside the industry. Many of you are from inside the industry, or you're in communities that do it. But I'd say there's a congregation, but not a choir. So one of my aims today is to take you from being a congregation to a choir. So whenever I speak, whatever the audience is, I want to make them more in favor of what I believe in, which is energy abundance, and the overwhelming source of energy abundance in the world is hydrocarbons or fossil fuels. So if you're a non-supporter of energy abundance and fossil fuels, I want to make you a supporter. If you're a supporter, I want to make you a champion. And if you're a champion, I want to make you a thought leader. So today we're going to discuss the key concepts, I think, that are necessary, to go from a non-supporter all the way to a thought leader. But the other reason I think it's wrong when people expect, oh, you're just wearing this shirt for us who are favorable, is actually this was not designed for you. It was designed for anti-fossil fuel rallies. So I thought I'd show you a little clip of me wearing this shirt. This was last year in New York City at the People's Climate March, so-called, which is an anti-fossil fuel rally, which featured 100,000 opponents of fossil fuels and one supporter. Do you hear what they're saying? Hey, hey, ho, ho, fossil fuels have got to go. I have a very different opinion on the matter. Let's go see if we can engage. Can we just go stand in the middle?
It gives you like a good background.
Hey guys.
idea.
All right. So when I'm at those rallies, and I go to quite a few, but also when I'm other places like here, the number one question I get is why are you here? Where do you come from? Why is it you who wrote a book called Moral Case for Fossil Fuels? And there are usually two assumptions which are really, really off the mark. One is, oh, you must work for the fossil fuel industry or you must have been paid off by them. And I actually didn't even meet anyone in the fossil fuel industry until I had been making these arguments for 5 years. And at first, the fossil fuel industry resisted me because my arguments were too extreme. Fortunately, I think they're realizing that the truth should not be considered extreme. Now, the second reason is that people assume, well, maybe you came from a place like Kern County. Maybe you grew up in some pro-fossil fuel hotbed, you have family connections, and thus you can't shake off your learned love of fossil fuels. So I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C., which you may or may not know is not a hotbed of pro-fossil fuel sentiment. So no, and throughout my education, I was fortunate enough to go to one of the top 10 high schools in the country for math and science. And I went to Duke University, one of the top 10 colleges in the country. And throughout that, I did not learn one positive thing about fossil fuels. I was told many negative things, but not one positive thing. But the reason that I got into this, and the reason in retrospect it feels almost inevitable, is because my focus was a subject that I think is the most important subject for thinking about fossil fuels and advocating for them, but that no one really appreciates. And so that subject is moral philosophy. So moral philosophy is all about how do we think carefully about the important issues in life? How do we look at the big picture? How do we really know what's right and wrong? And I talk about this in the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, in a lot of depth. When I looked at how this country thinks about energy, I thought this would fail any freshman logic class. For example, one basic rule of thinking about moral issues is you have to look at all of your alternatives and you have to look at both the positives and the negatives of all the different alternatives. And you have to look at them carefully. It's common sense, right? But when I noticed, hey, wait, my whole education, I never learned one positive thing about fossil fuels and only negative, and I never learned one negative thing about solar and wind, only positive. So how can I possibly get the right answer if I'm getting a biased discussion? And the other thing is, people are never very clear. One of the rules in philosophy is you have to be very clear on your terminology. For example, if you ever read Plato's Dialogues, which has Socrates, Socrates ultimately gets really sentenced to death for doing this, but he's always asking people, what exactly do you mean by that term? If you say justice, what do you mean by justice? If you say piety, what do you mean by piety? And so if I ask someone, hey, climate change, what exactly do you mean by climate change? Nobody's too clear. Does it mean climate changes? Does it mean we have a little influence? Does it mean we have a lot of influence? Does it mean it's man-made? Does it mean there's a catastrophe? Those things make a big difference. Because on one scenario, if Al Gore was right and we were causing rapid 20-foot rises in sea levels, and he also says we can easily replace oil and gas, I guess like Tom Steyer believes, if that were true, that would be a moral case against fossil fuels. But if we had a very mild influence on climate and fossil fuels were indispensable for billions of people, then there would be a very strong moral case for using more fossil fuels, which, as you might imagine, is what I believe. But anyway, I think that careful thinking is in short supply in thinking about the issue. And that's when I talk to college students and go to universities, particularly ones that have a very strong animus toward fossil fuels, I focus on that. But I think philosophy is equally important even if you're already a supporter of fossil fuels, because I think it's really confounding and confusing to people who know the value that this industry brings. It's confusing. Why is it so hated? Why is it so under attack? And today I'm going to give you 3 concepts that, at the risk of promising too much, I think will make total sense of that. It'll make total sense of why you're under attack, and it'll make total sense of what the solution is. So the 3 concepts, and I'll repeat them over and over. 1 is called the Hydra. 2 is called arguing to 0 versus arguing to 100. And 3 is called moral standard. So there's the Hydra, arguing to 0 versus arguing to 100. and moral standard. I'm going to keep saying them over and over so that 10 years from now, you can give this lecture to somebody. So first, the Hydra. I want to make an observation about the political scene with fossil fuels. By the way, my timer is stopped, so effectively I have infinite time, in case anyone is wondering. That's fine. If we observe the policy debate over fossil fuels, one thing really stands out to me. Actually, two things. If I were to use two words to describe the advocates of fossil fuels in the debate, the words I would use would be overwhelmed and reactive. Overwhelmed and reactive. Because what happens is there's just this onslaught of policy proposals to, in one way or another, restrict fossil fuels, whether it's anti-LNG exports, anti-coal exports, anti-fracking in every state and city, the Clean Power Plan, so-called, all of these different actions. And occasionally you might get one like cap and trade that doesn't work for the time being, but it gets replaced by others. So you have more and more and more and more. And on the other side, on the defenders of fossil fuels or the advocates, it doesn't seem like they're putting anything positive on the table. It just seems like they're reacting and reacting and reacting. So I describe the pro-fossil fuel side as overwhelmed and reactive, and I describe the anti-fossil fuel side as overwhelming and proactive. So it's worth asking, and this gets to the Hydra, why is this? Why does it seem like just one damn thing after another? And people work really, really hard in PR departments to try to fight it, and government relations departments, and it's just over and over and over, and you can't stop it. Even with a conversation, it's just, your uncle, if they live outside here, raise it, like a million different objections over and over and over. Why is this? Why do they always seem to have the high ground? And this gets to the idea of a Hydra. So has anyone here ever heard of the mythical Greek beast, the Hydra? So the Hydra is this multi-headed beast. It's this deadly beast that has lots and lots of different heads. Now, shout out for those of you who know of the Hydra. What happens when you cut off one of the heads of the Hydra? Two more grow back. So the Hydra is the type of beast where if you fight it on the superficial level, if you fight it on the level of one of the heads, you don't gain anything, you lose. But if you can cut out the heart of the Hydra, then you can kill all of the heads. So whenever we have a problem that seems like one thing after another, it's a good question to ask, are we dealing with a Hydra? And in this case, the answer is absolutely yes. If you step back and look at every anti-fossil fuel proposal and policy, you'll notice that they have one thing in common, and that is that they are all based on the same goal or the same ideal that most of the society agrees with. And that ideal is the ideal of getting off of fossil fuels and on to green energy. So pretty much everyone agrees the ideal society is one in which we get rid of fossil fuels and replace it with green energy. And so if you look at every proposal, whether it's anti-fracking or anti-exports or anti-anything else or mandates for solar and wind, every single one has the same narrative and the same ideal. This is how we're going to get off fossil fuels. So even if you point out a problem with one or another, they'll still say, well, this is the right direction. And even if you say, oh, well, cap and trade, that's not efficient, they'll just come up with the Clean Power Plan. They'll just come up with another thing, unless the ideal is questioned. So the Hydra, the heart of the Hydra, is the ideal of eliminating fossil fuels and replacing them with green energy. So that's point number one, the Hydra. So this is understanding the nature of it. Now the next point is arguing to zero versus arguing to 100. And this follows directly from the Hydra. So once you have a Hydra, once you have an ideal, you own the territory. If you're the person, if the debate is framed so that you're after the ideal and the other side is after the wrong thing, you're going to win. So what happens is here, I'm going to make a lot of your engineers, so hopefully you'll like this. I'm going to make an invisible x-axis, okay? So over here is going to be negative 100, okay? So about here is going to be 0, and about here is going to be 100. Got it? Just simple x-axis. Okay. So over here, negative 100, it's a moral axis. So negative 100 is evil, the worst possible thing. Okay, 0 is neutral. It's nothing. It's neither good nor bad. And 100 is noble or saintly. It's the best possible thing. So on the current axis, 100 in energy is eliminating fossil fuels completely and replacing it with green energy completely. And negative 100 is continuing to use more and more fossil fuels. That's the worst possible thing. So when they have that axis, every single policy, they are arguing to 100. They are saying this is bringing us toward the good thing. And with every policy in favor of developing fossil fuels, they're arguing you to negative 100. They're saying you're doing the wrong thing. Now, if this is the framework, you sort of have two options. One is you can say, I disagree with the labels on the x-axis. I disagree that eliminating fossil fuels is the ideal and replacing it with green energy is the ideal. I disagree that using more fossil fuels is evil. I want to change that moral axis. I want to reframe the issue. But that is not what the industry has done historically, and what Republicans have done. Instead, they've accepted this x-axis, but what they've said is, yes, the ideal is to eliminate fossil fuels, to replace it with green energy. Yes, it's wrong to keep using more and more fossil fuels, but fossil fuels are a temporarily necessary evil. We need to temporarily do the wrong thing because it's impractical. So with cap and trade, they didn't say it's an immoral goal. They just said, this will cost you too much money right now. But the ideal is still to get off fossil fuels. So we don't really have a debate over the morality of fossil fuels in this country. We have one side saying it's an unnecessary evil, like Steyer and Gore, that we can get off quickly. And the other side says, no, it's a necessary evil that we need to get off slowly. So there's not really a debate over moral principles. There's a debate over expiration dates. It's like people talk about it as an addiction like heroin. It's like one side is saying, well, it's going to take you 10 weeks to get off heroin. And the other side is saying, oh no, it's going to take 10 months. But I would question whether it's heroin. And I think this is what doesn't happen. So here's what happens. So they're arguing to 100. Now what is arguing to 0? Well, let's take the example of hydraulic fracturing. I got to speak to a few of you last night, and I mentioned this example. I think it's illustrative. So if you take the example of hydraulic fracturing, what happened? Well, in my view, and I'll talk about the basis of this view in a minute, hydraulic fracturing was an amazing technological revolution. Let's say the modern version with horizontal drilling. The shale energy revolution was an amazing revolution for human life that was moving us toward the ideal of making life better and better. And we were doing it using this amazing technology, and the industry had an amazing story to tell. But the industry didn't tell that story back in 2007, 2008 when it was emerging. Instead, they let somebody else tell the story. And that somebody's name was he was a quasi-documentarian hack named Josh Fox, who made a set of images and sound called Gasland, right? Which said what? Which said that this is continuing our addiction to fossil fuels, and it's causing all of these specific issues. It's causing groundwater contamination, it's causing earthquakes, it's causing cancer. So if we're on our x-axis, this is what it looks like. So if you start off from 0, what he's arguing is it's continuing our addiction to fossil fuels, earthquakes, cancer, groundwater. And what is the industry? How does the industry respond? They don't say, no, you're thinking about it the whole wrong way. This is overall a really good thing. No. Instead, what they do is they try to argue back. They try to say, oh, no, you're wrong about this detail about groundwater. You're wrong about this detail about earthquakes. You're wrong about this detail about cancer. So here's my question. If you did this strategy perfectly, if you could somehow reassure everybody about all of their doubts, what would be the best case scenario on the moral perception of your industry with this strategy? 0. So this is called arguing to 0. So if your best case scenario in a rhetorical strategy is 0, you have a big problem. And we do have a big problem. But I think this starts to illustrate what's going on. So we've got the Hydra, which is this overwhelming set of attacks, but united by this one moral ideal. And then what we have is that moral ideal allows them to argue to 100, to argue us to negative 100, and because we don't challenge it, we argue to 0. But why don't we challenge it? So let's step back. because everyone is accepting on the axis of goodness and evil. The evil is to use a lot more fossil fuels, and the good is to get rid of fossil fuels and replace them with green energy. And one of the great things about philosophy is it causes us to ask, well, why? You ask why a lot. Why are we assuming that this is true? Does this actually make any sense? And to answer that, we have to go a step back. If we want to know what is the good form of energy, the ideal form of energy, we first have to know what is the ideal form of life. Energy is just one part of life. We have to know what is the goal in life. And if we look at this axis, it's really interesting that the ideal is green energy. I want to look at the assumption behind that, green energy. And in particular, green energy usually means solar and wind and sometimes biofuels. But let's observe what green energy almost never includes. Well, let's say that the real issue that people were concerned with was the fact that when we burn a hydrocarbon, we put more CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've gone from 0.03% CO2 in the atmosphere to 0.04% in the last 150 years. That's true, and we can expect that to have at least a mild warming effect. If that was really the concern, you wouldn't talk about green energy, you might talk about non-carbon energy. What's interesting is there are actually two forms of non-carbon energy that are very, very good, not as good at fossil fuels on a global scale, but very, very good at generating cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for millions of people. And those are nuclear power and hydroelectric power. So you might expect that if the real concern was CO2 emissions, that the people who are anti-fossil fuels would be rabid advocates of nuclear power and hydroelectric power. And yet, who are the biggest advocates of shutting down nuclear power plants and hydroelectric plants? The Greens, right? The so-called environmentalists. So green isn't about preventing any given environmental catastrophe, it's about something else. So we want to examine what that means, because if we're taking something as an ideal, and that means shutting down everything you do, you in particular should want to question that ideal. So what does green mean? Green, if you look up the definition, or there's lots of definitions, but there's an essence that cuts across all the different definitions. To be green means to minimize your impact on the planet. It means to minimize your impact on the planet. You want as little as possible. Now, this is considered virtuous, right? If a product is green, if a manufacturer makes a green product, if they just put green on it, they can probably hope to get another $1 per product just for putting it there, right? Because it's like motherhood. Who could question being green? Well, I think every self-respecting human could question being green. So let's analyze, what does green mean? If our goal is to really minimize our impact on the planet, if we take that seriously, and people do take it seriously, they're always shutting down development, stopping people from building houses, kicking people off their land because of sage grouses. People take this seriously. So I got a couple questions if we want to be green. Question number one, if we could go back in time to when we were deciding to take a patch of dirt and trees and turn it into New York City, and we brought Greenpeace and the Sierra Club and asked them, thumbs up or thumbs down, what's the green thing to do? Should we build New York City? What would they say? If anyone said thumbs up, come to me after and explain how. But no, everyone says thumbs down, right? Okay, so that's interesting. We've got an ideal that if practiced would lead to no New York City. Let's take another one. How about having a child? For most people, one of the most meaningful experiences in life. Okay, well, having a child, if you want to minimize your impact on nature, having a child is the single worst thing you could do, because you're continuing your impact indefinitely. It would be better off to not have children by this standard, which I disagree with, to drive a Hummer around 24 hours a day, than to have kids. And the green groups know this. They used to talk a lot about overpopulation, which means forced reduction in population. Now that's not as appealing to people, but here's what the Sierra Club says. They tell young women who are considering having children, what they say to those young women is, okay, maybe you can have a child, but keep in mind, your carbon legacy for every child you have will increase 6 times. That's your carbon footprint taken into the future. And that's considered bad. So we now have an ideal that's against building New York, against having children, and let's take another one. What about the worst place in the world, pretty much, North Korea. Let's compare it to its neighbor, South Korea. Now, if you've ever seen, they have these great overhead pictures of at night, South Korea is all bright and North Korea is dark, which, by the way, before the oil industry, the whole world was dark at night. Nobody seems to appreciate. Okay, here's the question. Which country is greener, North Korea or South Korea? Which has less of an impact on nature? North Korea is by far the greener country. It won an award. It was a joke award, but it's still based on facts, for having one of the top 10 lowest carbon footprints in the world. So they impact their environment far less. Now notice, here's what's interesting. South Korea has a much better environment. So human beings are much happier, but being green is not about having a good environment for humans. It's not about improving the planet for humans. It's about saving the planet from humans. It's about the idea that we shouldn't be impacting nature, we shouldn't be transforming nature. Well, in my mind, that's evil, because human beings survive by transforming nature. Nature does not give us a good standard of living. It doesn't. We used to live till 30 on average in a good society, just living with nature. There was no living in harmony with nature. There's only dying in harmony with nature. So if our ideal is to be green and we take that seriously, that means ultimately we shouldn't exist. So I really think we should question this. So this is the issue of moral standard. The moral standard is, what is the ideal by which we evaluate all our actions? And the moral standard behind green energy is being green, which means having as little impact as possible. And that's why they select, as the technologies they support, the least effective, worst performing energy technologies of the last 100 years, because those have the least impact on nature and that they don't really generate any reliable energy. So they don't care as much about, okay, it takes up a lot of space, sure, but the main thing that energy does, energy is a tool of impacting your environment. It's the capacity to do work. Work means force times distance. That means moving things. So energy by its nature is a transformer of our environment. So if we have an ideal that says we shouldn't transform our environment on a large scale, or really any scale, then the most successful forms of energy are going to be the most opposed. So what I'd argue with fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro, it's not about any of the negatives that might happen to human life, and every technology has positives and negatives. It's about the fact that we're changing things, that we're building things. And to show you the importance of this, how this sheds some light on things, I want to give you just a little overview of how you analyze fossil fuels if you switch the ideal. So over here was being green, minimizing our impact, and then over here was maximizing our impact. That's the underlying ideal. And I think this is a ridiculous way of looking at life, thinking of let's minimize our impact versus maximizing our impact. I don't define it that way. My ideal is I want to maximize human well-being. And on the other side, anything that minimizes human well-being is evil. So minimizing impact is one thing that minimizes human well-being, so that's an evil ideal. But if we make our ideal, if we switch our moral standard from minimizing human impact to maximizing human well-being, and we look at fossil fuels with that yardstick, everything changes dramatically. And I would bet that every person in this room at one point or another has accepted the wrong yardstick in looking at fossil fuels. And I want to show you that once you look at it with the right yardstick, everything changes. So once you say, I'm going to look carefully at what benefits human life, I'm going to look at the big picture, it's astonishing that the case for fossil fuels is much stronger than you think. And that's what brought me from a non-supporter to a supporter, from a supporter to a champion, from a champion to a thought leader, is this. I was interested in philosophy. I saw it being applied badly. I applied it myself and was shocked at the results. And I think the world will be shocked if they actually know the truth. So let me just give you a little bit of an overview. Since my timer is not working, can anyone give me where we are on time? How many minutes we are in? Good. You're good? Oh, you're happy?
Yeah, great.
Okay, well, hopefully she speaks for all of you. Otherwise, you can subtly walk out. Okay, thank you. So. Oh, we don't need to do that.
New Scientist magazine.
I'll show you this in a second. That's fun. This is Jimmy Fallon, making a really good case. But before we get to that, this is how I think of the issue of moral standard. I don't know if we can put that back up, but this is my moral standard. This is how I evaluate all of these issues. And my contention is when we look at the issues with this moral standard as our perspective, everything changes. So the issue I want to focus on today is the climate issue, because I think that's the most contentious issue. The other two big issues that are used to criticize fossil fuels are the pollution issue, that fossil fuels can cause pollution, and the depletion issue, concerns about running out. And those are addressed in the last half of the book, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and a lot of the essays that I have free online. But I want to talk about the climate issue because I think that'll show you how the methodology works, and I think that's the most urgent one to be able to reframe. Okay, so this is the standard. Now, if we're on the standard of human life, let's take the question that you most often get asked, at least if you live where I do, which is Laguna Beach. So they might see me wearing this shirt, and I do wear this where I live. They'll say, wait, how can you like fossil fuels? Don't you believe in climate change? Like, don't you believe in climate change? I say, well, that's an interesting question. Like, I might first ask, well, what exactly do you mean by climate change? Because it can mean 12 different things. But if I just think about it myself, if my goal is to benefit human life as much as possible, to say I believe in climate change, therefore we should get rid of fossil fuels, well, that doesn't really make much sense, because if we're going to think about the big picture, we have to look at both the positives and the negatives, or potential negatives, very carefully. And so it would, and climate change, and the better term is climate influence or climate impact, man-made climate influence. If we look at that, what that is a potential side effect of using fossil fuels. Everything in life has risks and side effects. That's a potential risk or side effect of using fossil fuels. So I'll say, of course, we need to look at that, but would you agree that we need to look at all the benefits and risks of all the different technologies to get to the right answer? And people will usually say yes. But imagine we use this same methodology that's used to oppose it to say, oh, there's climate change, therefore fossil fuels are bad. So this has a side effect, therefore you shouldn't use it. What if we did that with vaccines? So, if I had kids, and let's say I'm vaccinating my kids in whatever the most responsible way is, and somebody says to me, wait, you're vaccinating your kids? You believe in vaccines? Don't you know vaccines can have side effects? Are you a vaccine side effect denier? Well, how would you respond? You'll say, well, no, but I've looked at the big picture, and I think in the big picture it's enormously beneficial. I think the risks of not doing it are far greater than the risks of doing it. The risks of doing it, did I say that right? Yeah, the risks of not doing it are far greater than the risk of doing it, as in vaccines. And that would make sense, but we need to think of everything the way we would think of vaccines, although I think a lot of the anti-vaccine movement now is based on this kind of wrong thinking, not thinking carefully about the big picture. So if you want to look at the climate issue, what you need to do is you need to look at both what are the unique benefits of fossil fuels, if any, and what are the unique risks of it, and particularly with the climate issue. So I think if we do that, we find a really interesting picture. So I don't need to I often explain to audiences what are fossil fuels. Hopefully most of you know, although a lot of people don't. But if we look at the trend, so this is since 1980, year I was born, my parents were told, their generation was told, you need to get off your addiction to fossil fuels. Well, obviously, they did not do a very good job, because we use 80% more fossil fuels around the world than we did in 1980, and I'm very, very grateful to them for not doing the so-called right thing, and I hope we continue to do the wrong thing, because that'll make billions of people better off. Now, people say, oh, well, we can replace fossil fuels. They're not really that, there are no unique benefits. Well, if we see this kind of trend, if we've heard for decades and decades and decades that you can replace fossil fuels, and it still doesn't come true, it's a little far-fetched to think it's some sort of global conspiracy. And you might suspect, well, like any other industry, the best overall technology is winning, right? People find that we need cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, and if we use fossil fuels 87% of the time, maybe it's the best 87% of the time, more or less. And I think the person who gave the best explanation of why was Jimmy Fallon, even though he's anti-fossil fuels, but he doesn't realize that he explained why he should be pro-fossil fuels. Because Jimmy Fallon, one of the reasons he's anti-fossil fuels is he hears the argument, well, why don't we get our energy from the sun, directly from the sun? He probably doesn't know fossil fuels are energy from the sun, just stored very efficiently by nature, right? He says, why don't we get energy from the sun? And Al Gore tells him energy from the sun is free and it's forever. And I would certainly like something that's free and forever, right? So what's going on? Well, Jimmy Fallon actually explains why. I think I need to take it the other direction.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
Okay, so that seems funny. That was in about 2000, and it always stuck with me because I kind of wonder, well, why wouldn't that work? And later I thought, wait a second, isn't hazelnut energy renewable energy? Isn't it natural? Doesn't it come from the sun? Isn't it free forever? Why is it so expensive? And this gets to a fundamental point that we're never taught. Let me go a couple of slides forward. Which is that energy is not something we just get directly from nature. Nature doesn't give us usable energy for our machines. All forms of energy are manufactured, which means they involve a process, a multi-stage process. And it is incredibly, incredibly difficult and an incredible achievement to make large amounts of energy reliably for an affordable price. There are only 3 industries who have done it on any scale: the hydrocarbon industry, the nuclear industry, and the hydroelectric industry. And those are the most persecuted, which I think is shameful. So people do not realize that the reason that the fossil fuel industry is the most successful is it's because it's the only one that has a resource efficient process that can provide energy for billions and billions of people. And that means that to the extent we restrict it, let alone outlaw it, we're sentencing billions and billions of people to earlier deaths. And to give you some stats, we live in a world where for everyone to have the same amount of energy as the average American, you'd need 4 times more energy. 4 times more energy, and you only have one industry that can supply it to today's 7 billion, let alone going on 9 billion people. So you're talking about massive need for energy. You've got 3 billion people in the world, almost half the world, have almost no energy, which is almost unfathomable to us. But what it means not to have a refrigerator, not to have a light bulb in many cases. I mean, it's to be using things like hand plows. I mean, not to have modern agriculture, but this is the lot that many people have. For them, their lives to improve, just like people's lives have improved in the Tiger Republics, let alone our country, they need more energy to power more machines to improve more lives. And if we look at how solar and wind, this claim that we should not only restrict fossil fuels, but also nuclear and hydro, to use solar and wind, and you hear these claims like, well, Germany has proven that it can be done. Well, I wanted to know the answer to that, so I paid $2,000 to the European Energy Commission, and they were willing to give me the data from Germany on a 15 minute by 15 minute basis, so I could see how does solar and wind actually supply Germany with energy. So it supplies it like this. So this is just electricity, by the way. Electricity is only half of Germany's energy usage. The rest is heating and fuel, and that's 0% solar and wind. But what you notice here is that it's very spiky. It's very erratic. It's very unreliable. And in particular, it goes the lowest when energy is needed the most. In the winter in Germany, which happens to be a cold place without a ton of sunlight. So what happens? Well, they might only get 3% or even less of their energy from solar and wind, which means what? Which means they need to have a backup, or really a life support, that's available 100% of the time. So what have they done? As they're bragging about being the greenest energy company in the world, their electricity prices have skyrocketed. They pay 40 cents a kilowatt hour compared to the average American paying 10 cents, so 4 times as much. They do that, but at the same time, they are still hitting records for coal capacity. So even as they're bringing up more and more solar and wind, that just creates more problems that they need coal to solve. If all of those solar and wind things were shut down tomorrow, they would be left with a more reliable grid and plenty of energy. If the coal was shut down, or 20% of it was shut down, that would be a major catastrophe for the country. So fossil fuels, there's really no such thing as wind power. There's just gas wind and coal wind and nuclear wind, and same with solar. There's gas solar and coal solar and wind solar, and not wind solar, they wish, and nuclear solar. So these are parasitical forms of energy. So the fact that we're talking about getting rid of the best forms of energy and replacing them with the worst and hoping for the best means that our thinking is not guided by human life as our standard. it's guided by being green. We're talking about solar and wind because they're supposedly natural. It's supposedly magical and good to get your energy directly from the sun and the wind, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. And it shouldn't. The best form of energy shouldn't be the most natural, it should be the most beneficial to human life. We want energy abundance, not energy poverty, and green energy is energy poverty. So even before we get to the issue of climate, which I'll get to now, we know that the focus of the anti-fossil fuel movement is not human life, because they do not care about the fact that what they propose would ruin billions of lives. They don't care. So here's what would actually happen. You know, what would have actually happened in the last several decades is that instead of China and India improving, and of course people always point to the negatives, but their life expectancy is both up by over 6 years, that's 6 years of life, and their income is dramatically up. So instead of that happening, that wouldn't have happened, and if we had listened to them, we would have a much lower standard of living. And yet nobody seems to care. So let's say there was a climate catastrophe coming from CO2 emissions. Let's stipulate that that was true. We would still have a very different attitude toward fossil fuels. We wouldn't say, oh yay, we get to get off fossil fuels and celebrate it and condemn the industry. We would regard it as a tragedy, and people would be saying to you, look, this is so sad because you are heroes who've made our lives possible, who've made the greatest standard of living in history possible. You've done this, and we're so grateful, and yet it turns out there's this tragic flaw and there's no immediate replacement. This is a tragedy. But it's not treated as a tragedy, it's treated as a celebration, which means people don't really care about energy. Now, some people, because they're not taught to care about it or to understand which forms of energy are efficient, but I think the leaders don't care about energy. They care, or life, human life. They care about being green, which means prioritizing non-human life over human life. That's what it means to be green. So let's go to the issue of climate now, looking at it from a human perspective, not a green perspective, a human perspective. So first of all, if we're looking at the issue of climate, we have to throw out the term climate change. This is just a deliberately manipulative term that was popularized because before they had global cooling, and if you flip a coin, you've got 50% chance of it being global cooling and 50% chance of it being global warming. And they actually got it wrong both times, right? Because they forecast global cooling right before it got warmer, and then they said global warming right before the temperature started flattening. So then they say, okay, climate change. This is a very vague term. The real issue, if you care about human beings, is climate danger. Is putting more CO2 in the atmosphere making the world more dangerous for human beings, which is a legitimate question because CO2 does have an impact on the atmosphere. But to understand the big picture, we have to look at three questions. So the first one is the greenhouse effect. What kind of warming effect, in particular, how big, how consequential is that warming effect of greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular? But we also need to look at two other effects that are never discussed because they're positive effects and we're taught never to think anything positive about fossil fuels. So the second one is the fertilizer effect. We learn in school that CO2 helps plants grow. And yet we never talk about it. We never talk about, hey, maybe putting more CO2 in the atmosphere has been overall good because it's helped plant growth around the world. We don't even think about this, which shows we have a bias. We're not focused on human life. And then the third one is the most important thing that's overlooked, which is what I call the energy effect, which is we're not just producing CO2 for the sake of producing CO2. We're producing CO2 as part of a process of generating energy. And generating energy is really important if you want a livable climate because nature doesn't give us a livable climate. People throughout history were terrified of the climate, terrified of nature. They invented gods to try to appease nature because nature would constantly give them storms and floods and droughts and all these other things. And it's only once we industrialized and developed that we could become a lot less afraid of climate. So one of the things if we care about people having a livable climate, they need plenty of energy. They need energy abundance. If someone says, oh, I'm going to give you energy poverty to save you from climate, that doesn't make any sense. That's like, I'm going to take away your medicine to save you from disease. It doesn't work. So we need to look at all of those three. So let's look just quickly at the arc of it. And again, you can check out resources online or you can check out the book. While I'm at it, let me just mention, you might not be able to see my pin. I have an I Love Fossil Fuels pin here. And we have a bunch of those available at the bookstore for free. I just hope that we have a sign-up sheet if you want to stay in touch, and in particular, I want to give you some what I call energy champion materials, so materials that you can just send for free to all of your friends, and particularly your friends outside Kern County, and persuade them. So those are at the bookstore. If we run out, go to moralcaseforfossilfuels.com, enter your email address, moralcaseforfossilfuels.com. Okay, so we've got that. I just want to give you an outline of how this works, and then you can read up on the details as you wish. So if we look at the greenhouse effect, so we're going to go through some slides pretty quickly. First thing to notice, with any theory, someone says we're going to have catastrophic global warming. First thing I want to know is, how long has that theory been around? How has it performed? Short answer, it's been around 40 years. It's completely failed. So we had James Hansen. This is him when he's younger. I used to have an older picture of him. But he's got, in 1986, he was testifying before Congress. Or maybe it was just 1986 to 1988. He was doing a lot of testimony before Congress and in the public. And he became famous for saying that our temperature between the years 2000 and 2010 was going to rise between 2 and 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if that had happened, that would be really scary. Because in the 150 years before that, it rose less than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would mean in 1 decade, you had more warming than you had in 150 years, maybe twice as much warming. So it's worth asking what happened. Now, it didn't happen. And people expect it to happen, which is really weird, because if you study how the greenhouse effect works, you wouldn't expect dramatic warming. So here's how the greenhouse effect works. It's really important when we talk about anything to be precise. So if I want to know, is there going to be runaway global warming or not, and someone says there's a greenhouse effect, I want to know in mathematical terms what kind of effect this is. So I don't want to make it too mathematical, but there are different kinds of mathematical functions, and what they amount to is this. One interpretation would be every new molecule of CO2 in the atmosphere warms it more than the last. So I'll use a car analogy. Let's say I'm putting my foot on the accelerator, and I'm at 55 miles an hour. So in this interpretation, which people assume is true, every inch that I push down is going to make the car go faster. It's going to increase its velocity faster and faster and faster. So what that would mean is once I depress the pedal fast enough, I'm going to be a rocket ship taking off through space, right? Because it's going to go faster and faster and faster. It's like an exponential or a geometric function. So that's what people think the greenhouse effect is. Now, if that was true, that would be incredibly scary. It would also be sort of impossible if the Earth used to have, by the way, 20 times as much CO2 in the atmosphere than it used to. If that were true, right, the whole Earth would have burned to a crisp a long time ago. So, or it could be a linear effect, which means every inch you push down the gas makes the velocity increase at the same rate. But it turns out it's not even that. It's a decelerating effect, or what's called a logarithmic effect, which means every new molecule warms the atmosphere more than the last did. So every time you double it, basically, in many interpretations, it only increases at 1 degree. So what we would expect is not this runaway increase, but a mild impact. And Hansen was wrong. This is exactly what we found. So if you look at this, and just so you get, it's important because you're going to see these graphs all the time. And they look really big, but if you notice, the y-axis is like a degree. So it's this very small period, and they make it look dramatic. But notice that there's a time when we don't use much in the way of CO2 emissions, and the temperature still goes up. And then we increase it dramatically, and it goes up maybe a tiny bit faster, but then look at between 2000 and 2010 when Hansen predicted 2 to 4. How much does it go up? Nothing. So he was completely wrong. So he had a theory that somehow, even though it's logarithmic, even though it's decelerating, it's going to somehow in the atmosphere lead to this catastrophe. It did not happen, and yet he's not honest enough to own up to it. He just makes crazier and crazier predictions all the time. And the newspaper says, esteemed climate scientist James Hansen, who's gotten the global warming issue right for 40 years, blah, blah, blah. But this is not the truth. This is to just give you context of the amount of warming we're talking about. We're talking about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit in 150 years. This is barely discernible to us. So when people say, oh, it's the warmest whatever in history, what they mean is in this tiny slice of history, when we're at the peak of a very, very small trend, it's warmer. I mean, that's like, you're walking up a hill, like a very, very shallow hill with bumps, and you're like, oh, I'm at the highest I've ever been. But yeah, does that matter? Is it a big deal or not? If it's going like this, it would be a big deal. So what's happened is, with this idea that, 97% of scientists agree with climate change, that's garbage philosophical thinking because it's not precise. insofar as that study is true, and I have an article I can send you called 97% of climate scientists agree is 100% wrong. Insofar as that's true, this is what it means. It means that a lot of scientists agree that we have had some warming influence on the atmosphere, which I agree with. What they don't agree with, because they can't prove it remotely, is that this is extremely consequential, let alone that it's detrimental to human life. But what we can prove is that there is a fertilizer effect and an energy effect that are amazingly positive for human life. So let's go to the fertilizer effect. This should be obvious, but we never talk about it. The more CO2 you put in the air, all things being equal, the more plants grow. So when you do it in isolation, this is what it looks like. We have 0.04% CO2 in the atmosphere. Greenhouses, to grow plants, put 3 times as much because plants love CO2. These studies have been done on all kinds of different plants, and you see over and over and over, the more CO2 you put in, the more plant growth you get. There was an oil executive who gave this great line at a panel I saw him on, and he was an oil executive, so I appreciated what he said. In particular, he said, if plants could vote, they would vote for coal. Now let's, though, talk about the really big issue, which is danger. Has it really gotten more dangerous? Because that's what I care about. I don't want myself or my future children or my friends or cousins or nieces and nephews or whomever, I do not want them to have an unlivable climate, to say the least. So what I'm concerned about is, in the last 40 years, as it's been predicted that we're going to have climate disaster, what has actually happened? So a good example is John Holdren. This is our energy advisor to the president, the leading, most influential scientist in American politics, predicted in 1985 that by the year 2020, we'd have 1 billion deaths related to famine caused by fossil fuels. So your industry would be responsible for 1 billion people dying prematurely. Well, actually, we have many more people than we did back then, but malnutrition rates have gone down by 40%. So that means literally billions more people have food who didn't used to have food. And that's not an accident. That's because of fossil fuels. The reason why we have the agricultural revolution in large part is because we have natural gas generated fertilizer and because we have mechanized agriculture powered by diesel fuel. We have a modern harvester that can reap enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. Imagine if you strapped a windmill on a harvester or a solar panel, how much it would be able to reap. Or put an electric battery, it would just be not even close. So your industry has fed the world. I have a section in the book called How the Fossil Fuel Industry Solved World Hunger. And that's not a joke. That is a literal truth in my mind. So let's look at the data. So we have the data. He was wrong on food, but what about everything else? Isn't it true that storms have gotten more deadly, that floods have gotten more deadly, that heat has gotten more deadly than cold, right? We read about this in the paper all the time. Every new storm that kills anyone is blamed on fossil fuels. But that is not a legitimate way of thinking. We need to look big picture overall. What are the trends? And it's interesting because I discovered this stat about 5 years ago. There's a stat that measures exactly this. It's a stat called climate-related deaths. And it's interesting because the people who supposedly care about climate danger will never mention this stat. And the reason is because it totally refutes their theory. Because they've predicted climate's going to become more dangerous as we put more CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, there is something called the International Disaster Database that measures climate-related deaths from heat and cold and floods and storms and everything like that, everything that's supposedly made worse by fossil fuels. So I was really shocked when I learned this data. So what happens? More fossil fuels we use, climate-related deaths plummet. Give you a couple of specific statistics. In the 30s, which is the first decade we have good data, there's not much data before that, you have several years where there are 3 million or more climate-related deaths around the world, 3 million or more. Adjusted for population, that's 10 million. That would be the equivalent of 10 million a year, people around the world dying from climate. In the year 2013, which was the most up-to-date data when I wrote the book, we had under 30,000 die from climate-related causes. So we went from 10 million to under 30,000. So what happened? The narrative is totally backwards. What they say is we've taken a naturally safe climate. They think the climate is perfect and we've ruined it and made it unsafe. No, the climate is incredibly unsafe naturally. It's variable, it changes all the time, it's volatile, it's vicious. What we've done is we've taken a naturally dangerous climate and made it far, far safer. So the thing to be concerned about with climate is not exactly how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. Again, there's been 20 times more. Now, if we got down to half as much as we have now, a lot of plants would die. That would be bad. But it's not, are we putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere? It's, are we giving people the energy and technology they need to make their climate safer and to make every aspect of their life better? And that's what this industry is doing. So it's not just that this industry isn't that bad with regard to climate, it's that this industry is essential with regard to climate livability. We would have a much less livable climate without the fossil fuel industry. And if we restricted those poor people in the third world whom all the anti-fossil fuel activists claim to care about, they will be much more devastated by all of nature's climate ravages. So there's a lot more detail on all that, but what I wanted to give you as the methodology is that when you think of it from a human basis, it totally changes it. Once you think of it from, I care about maximizing human well-being, not minimizing human impact, and you think big picture, thinking carefully about positives and negatives, everything changes. So just to summarize how it applies to the others, with pollution, all we are taught to look at is, oh, how much is the oil industry polluting? But you can't do that. You also have to look at how much is the oil industry cleaning up? Because nature is not a clean place naturally. And if we look at the state of the earth, our environment has gotten better and better because the number one polluter, the number one environmental danger to human life is Mother Nature. So every piece of data we have about even clean air, clean water, because you used to have to burn wood in your home or coal in your home, everything has gotten better. So it's just like we haven't taken a naturally safe climate and made it dangerous, we've taken a naturally dangerous climate and made it safe, so we haven't taken a naturally clean environment and made it dirty. We've taken a naturally dirty environment and making it far, far cleaner. And the same is true with resources. People think in all of these issues, nature is perfect, we ruin it. Wrong. Nature is not perfect. It's perfectible, it's got lots of potential, it's amazing if we make it amazing. With resources, here's a survey. Who here believes that oil and gas are valuable natural resources? Who believes that they're not valuable natural resources? Okay, I wonder how many of you read the book. Okay, well, the majority is wrong. They are not valuable natural resources because they are not naturally resources, right? We call it a resource, but was oil a resource before Edwin Drake and other heroes figured out how to turn useless glop into black gold? Oil is naturally useless. What about aluminum, for that matter? Aluminum is one of the most abundant elements in the earth, but it wasn't a resource until human ingenuity transformed it into a resource. So when they say your industry is depleting the earth of resources, I find that to be a disgusting evaluation. No, you're creating new resources. You're finding new ways of turning a non-resource into a resource. And that's what the shale revolution did. Shale revolution basically amounts to someone found a useless rock, and there are 2 Texases worth of this stuff at least, and they figured out a way to turn a useless rock and use it to charge your iPhone or power your car, right? To generate the energy that would do that. That is amazing. We should be celebrating that. And I think we will celebrate that if we learn how to think about the issue from a human perspective. So to go back to the 3 concepts, there's the Hydra that's overwhelming us. And it's overwhelming us because it has this ideal that allows them to argue to 100 and makes us argue to 0, or we choose to argue to 0. But if we challenge the moral standard on which that ideal of getting off fossil fuels is based, if we challenge the moral standard of being green, and we replace it with the moral standard of maximizing human well-being, we discover that fossil fuels are not an unnecessary evil that we need to get off quickly. They're not a necessary evil that we need to get off slowly. They are a superior good that we should be using more and more of as long as they're the best technology on the market. So that is the moral case for fossil fuels, and this needs to be taught to everybody. Unfortunately, it's not taught to anybody. It's getting taught to more people, but I think the number one mistake the industry makes is they think this is a debate about facts when it's actually a debate about moral framework. It's not a debate primarily about facts, it's a debate about moral framework. So everything you do when you talk to people from now on, remember that everything needs to be reframed and repositioned into the moral framework of maximizing human well-being. So the moral case for the fossil fuels is the human case for fossil fuels. And my goal in all of this, in speaking to you, in speaking to anyone, is I want to speak either people that disagree with me that I can convert, or people who agree with me that want to become champions or thought leaders. And my own mission is to create the materials that will empower you to do that. So the moral case for fossil fuels is, I think, the best thing I've created so far. I'm working on an Energy Champions course that will help everyone, I think, talk more effectively to their friends and neighbors. But please go to moralcaseforfossilfuels.com. Please sign up, just give your email, because there's just free stuff. The internet is amazing. We can change the world literally for free if we just share the right framework and the right ideas with the right people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I told you folks that you were in for a good treat with Alex. Well, that's about it, folks. You are now invited to go outside and enjoy a post-summit reception, courtesy of Mercedes-Benz of Bakersfield. But before we do, you haven't taken your test yet, have you?
I get to play Jeopardy!
Okay. The answer is, in 1932, this world-famous aviator landed in Taft.
Who is Amelia Earhart?
Another correct response. We haven't had a miss all day. However, I should point out that Amelia didn't plan to land in Taft. She had airplane trouble and wound up taking a car back to Los Angeles. A final note from me to all of you. This is the longest time I have ever spent in Taft, and it has been an enjoyable visit. As I mentioned earlier, I spent time on one of my trips here to the Petroleum Museum. And I got a chance last night and this morning to get a better sense of the city itself. Who knows, one of these days I may come back and go skydiving. But I would hope that the next time I come through Taft, and there will be many times when I do, because I still have a place up at Lake Nacimiento, that you folks will be just as friendly to me then as you have been yesterday and today. Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Alex Trebek. You have made our day, among other people, Alex Epstein, Kevin McCarthy, Christina Sistrunk. They're together right there. Greta Leidacker, Christina Sistrunk, Rob Duco, Bob Barnes, thank you so much. I do just want to say that Mr. T. Boone Pickens certainly was a highlight of today. We did film everything, and we will be putting it on YouTube very soon, so you can watch it again if you choose to. And I would like to say that Cafe Med is going to be outside with wine and water and Coke and beer and whatever you'd like. And Hodell's has a little bit of food if you're still hungry. I do want to say thank you to everybody. There's too many people to thank, but I just want to say thank you, everybody. This was great. Be careful going home and have a great time tonight. Thank you.